Chapter 1 and 2 test is out there. I thought I already had it out there, but I didn't. What did I put as the due date on that?
Wednesday.
Wednesday. Okay. So it's due the 1st. It was supposed to be due today, but I didn't realize till this weekend that it wasn't there. Because I thought I had put it out there, and then when I went to put it out there, I discovered that I had to create a new test for it because we've changed the versions from last year, and I thought I was just putting the test out from last year. So I created that and put it out there and sent y'all an email saying when it was due.
I do it right now.
Hmm?
Do it right now.
No, don't do it right now because you got to pay attention to class. So don't forget to do the test by Wednesday. Hopefully I didn't confuse too much people on what was supposed to be an announcement about tomorrow. But when I wrote it last night, that when I looked at it again, that I realized it was a little confusing on it there. It was intended to say tomorrow.
I already did it this, so I got it retaken?
Hmm?
I already taken this. I got it retaken?
No. If you've already taken it, you've taken it. So you took it sometime since Saturday.
Can't retake a test.
Yeah.
Hmm?
I got a 90 score or something.
The chapter 1 and 2 test, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it became available Saturday afternoon, I think. It was either Saturday or Friday night, but I really think I did it on Saturday. Because I think I got the message from one of you, and I don't remember who,
That was me.
of where the test was.
Yeah. I was gonna take it.
And I went out there to look, and I went, where's the test? And then when I went to activate on it, it said, nope, it didn't match to the current materials. So then I had to sit there and create the test and go through and choose questions for the test. So we've got a test there now. And then I sent out the announcement to y'all and told you I was going to extend it to Wednesday because of that. Okay? So it is there. And obviously at least 2 of you have taken it. I could actually look and see who all's taken it. 50 questions does mean there are only 2 points a question. You got 62 minutes to take it in. Okay? That's 1.25 minutes on average per question. That's where 62 came from. Which is standard for certification test.
Remember this, what's her name, the special ed department in Walker County campus, James C. Miss Brittany Elrod?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had to go by there and give you my papers, because I have extended time for tests. It said I had to go by there anyways to give it to you, and I had to go leave right now because I had to go study and go by there and give it to you.
Okay, she's on this campus too, you know.
Right now?
I don't know when she's here. I don't know when she's which.
Yeah, I have to get home and study, 'cause I'm not going to be able, I have to do chapter 1 and 2 tests. I don't want to do chapter 3 right now because I'm not anywhere yet.
Well, that's your decision.
It is, I won't be kicked out because of that.
Hmm?
I'll get kicked out because of that. I'll be kicked out for being class.
No.
Oh.
Y'all are supposed to be mature adults that know when you should be where. All right, chapter 3 is going over several things about the system. I'm going to flip back a couple of screens. So the cases and the form factors are covered in 3.1. System components is 3. So we got several things to do in here. Power supplies are in here, but the system board is the first one they talk about on you. And they mentioned that the system boards come in several sizes. I'm going to guess, and I haven't really looked in them to see, but from what Mr. Spurlock said, I'm guessing that those couple of new PCs we got in the back of the next room, those 3 new ones in there, I'm suspecting they've got mini ITX boards in them. He said they didn't have hardly anything in them. It was just a small board, and said about that big, which is about that big. So I'm assuming they must be using a mini ITX board in them. I'm also assuming, but I have not looked in them to see exactly what's in them, that these virtual machines, we've got most of the campus now. On this campus, they're probably using the mini ITX board also. Okay? Because they're, again, that size. And basically all that's there is the motherboard without add-ons to it. So that's a new, relative recent one. The micro ATX one is one you're going to encounter a lot of out there, which is a larger one there. It's a square one, a 9.6 by 9.6. So you've got a lot of them are going to use the micro ATX. The ATX one is just bigger on it, and it'll use up the more of the cabinet on it. And then I've never seen this one mentioned before, the EX. Okay, so that's a new one to me on there. See if they tell you anything down here. So it says it's got additional space for additional memory slots on it. So it would be honest, this obviously for servers is where it's designed for. Okay. The ATX one, 7 expansion slots, the micro ATX 4 expansion slots. And you may or may not have that many expansion slots actually in them. Because a lot of times the micro ATX one will only have 2 expansion slots in it. So that's your major ones out there on it. Let's see what else they've got there that they want to mention to you. And those other ITX ones they mention on down there. And actually the ITX, so the ITX should be what's sitting in the virtual machines, because they are fitting those descriptions there on it. With small power usage, and there it says typical for home theaters, but could be different. And then they mentioned the cases to support them. There are different type cases to support the different type motherboards. So if you're buying a motherboard and a case, make sure you buy them to match each other, because where the screw holes are lined up in the case got to line up with the motherboard. Okay, and depending on which motherboard you're using depends on where the screws are located in it. So that's a standard piece to it. But then they go on and tell you that the micro ones can have some difference to them. Questions on those? So it's just standard formats. Just if you're looking at motherboards or you're looking at cases, that there's a certain case you like, then you've limited yourself on motherboards and vice versa. If you choose a certain motherboard, you got to choose a case that fits that motherboard. In some cases, and in a lot of cases, there's both situations. My situation, if I'm buying a computer or buying parts to put one together, I'm looking in terms of the motherboard and then getting a case if it's a motherboard. Some of you may look out there and see some neat case that's got all kinds of lights on it and everything else, and that you want to get that case, so then you got to get a motherboard that matches to the case that you really like. So y'all can see that there's people are going to get caught both ways. Okay, power supplies. Big object of the power supply is it converts AC power to DC power. Takes it from alternating current to direct current. Taking 120 volts or 240 volts, and most of your power supplies are designed for both, with a switch on the back of them that allows you to run it to have 240 or 120 input. That makes them universal power supplies, okay? They can be used wherever you want to use them in the world then, okay? Because some parts of the world works on 240 volts, some parts of the world, like us, works on 120, well actually 110 to 120 is what it ranges on, that it doesn't necessarily hit exactly on that. So you'll see it as 110 sometimes, but it's 110 to 120. And that we're wanting to convert from the electrical outlet, the electrical supply we're getting, to go through the power supply. It then converts it down to what we're going to run the computer on. Components in the computer are going to run either at 3.3, 5, or 12 volts. Okay? It should be further on down here somewhere, but so that we're going to produce our direct current to run off of it. So we've got 3.3, 5, and 12. There you go. Says there most modern components require 12 volt output. But you've got a number of things in there that are running at 3.3, and 3.3 didn't used to be in there. So if you go to machines that are a good bit older, you're going to find them just using the 5 and the 12. Okay? But 3.3 is a more recent usage on it, that you've got things in there running only on 3.3 volts. The less voltage you can run it on, the less heat it's going to generate from it. So that's the object of getting your memory to run on 3.3 and such things, that keep that heat factor down on it. Your power supply is not considered a serviceable unit. So if it goes bad, that you just replace it. That it's not something you open up and work on inside the power supply. It has a fan built into it. If that fan goes bad, you just go and buy another power supply. Does everybody follow on that? One of the factors is, it's just like on the old CRT monitors, pay attention on this, that they've got capacitors sitting in them that hold high voltages. Okay? You've got the same thing happening inside that power supply as it's stepping down the voltage on it. Okay? And so if you went in to work on the power supply, you could get yourself an electric shock without meaning to. So basically, and if you look at the outside of them, they've almost always got a sticker on them that says it's a not serviceable unit. Now I realize that when it says not serviceable unit, for a number of you in here, that probably you don't read the not on there. That you know they've written that just meaning, if you don't know what you're doing, don't go in this. Well, actually, even if you know what you're doing, you're not going to go in it either. Okay? So treat it as a not serviceable unit. You just replace them. And they don't cost you that much anyway. Okay? So the work to do work on it, it would be more than what you're going to be to buy another power supply for it. So, but it does have a fan on it, and it is blowing out of the thing. If the machine's acting up, one of the first things to check is see if that fan still works on the power supply. They do fail. If you reach back there and there's not air blowing out of it, there's a problem. And they will overheat and shut down. Okay? And that if the fan quits working, they'll come on for a minute or two and then they go to shutting down. Because converting from AC to DC does produce a lot of heat. The other part is keep the vents on it clean, both inside your computer and on the outside where the fan's blowing out. So if it's blowing out really hot air on it or doesn't seem to be blowing, do look, open the case up of the computer and look and see if by chance you've got dust covering all the holes and it just can't pull any air through it. And if you just clean that dust layer off there, if that proceeds to solve it. So that is one thing you can do to the power supply, is clean the thing. Okay? If you did open it up, you would find there's a lot of open space inside the power supply also for air space to be moving through it, to be air cooling the stuff on it. But as a general rule, stay out of them, stay out of the CRT monitors, which are the big monitors that had the guns in them pointing at the screen, firing at the screen. All right. So then they note there that it's got a voltage switch that switches between 115 and 230, or like I said, it may say 110 to 120, somewhere in there. Okay. And then 230, it notes is used in Europe, and the 115 or 110 to 120 in the U.S. And then they note that there are some of the power supplies now that do have an automatic switch built in them where they detect what the voltage is coming in and that they flip accordingly, instead of you having to flip a switch on the back of it. But on a lot of them, it is just a little switch, and it's usually in red on the back, and it's inset so that you got to work to change it. It's not something you could just accidentally flip the switch on. It's usually inset where it's not just running your finger across the back of the computer that you would accidentally turn the switch on it. But the switch, you normally, when they come from the factory for you, when you get them, unless you've managed to get one that was built for Europe that came to you, that is going to be set correctly for you. Power switch may be on the power supply, may not be. That there's a lot of them now I'm seeing that don't have power switches back there on the power supply. But you may well have a switch on the power supply, and you used to always have a switch on the power supply, and that was actually at one time that was the way you turned the computer on and off. Okay? Now you got the switch completely on the front. They're rated in watts. And to find out what size of a power supply you need to take all of your items that you're going to use in the computer and calculate what the total wattage that you need for them. Power supplies keep getting bigger and bigger. I've noticed in their stuff, when I was glancing at it the other day, 450 is a number they're liking to use for a power supply. Wattage on it. You're going to find that a lot of them now that you're looking at getting a 600 to 750 or bigger power supply for your machines. But that was an improvement on their number from a year ago. They had smaller numbers out there. To get the wattage for each of your components, just see what the voltage and the amperage is of them and multiply those two numbers together, and that'll give you how much wattage that device uses. Okay? So if it doesn't tell you what the wattage is for some device you're going to be hooking onto that computer, pulling off of that power supply, you'll at least have the volts and the amps on it. Okay? So you have to calculate wattage as you need to add up. But make sure you've got a bigger wattage power supply than you've got total needs on your machine. And then note that there are tools out there you can go out and run that are online tools that you can tell it you're running whatever video card, because your video card's going to pull power. Your processor's going to pull power. Any other items you've got plugged into it or using inside of it, like your hard drive, is going to pull power and such on there. And that you need to add all of those up and see what you get, and then get a bigger one. If you get a smaller one than what the total amount is, you're going to be over pulling how much electricity you need, and the parts are going to not run like they should and also wear out much quicker than they should as they're trying to get enough electricity. ATX power supplies provide soft power. That's one to be aware of. What that's telling you is that even when the computer is turned off, still plugged in the wall but turned off, there is still power running onto that motherboard. Okay, because it runs through the motherboard to the switch with the soft power, and actually has 120 volts running through a spot on the motherboard to pull that switch that's on there when it uses soft power switching on it. Others, it runs a direct wire from the power supply to the switch on the computer and turns the motherboard on and off from there, turns the power supply off and on from there, and that you're turning the power supply off and on. Okay, but with the soft power ones, it's passing through the motherboard to the switch, and you actually have 120 volts sitting on a spot on the motherboard. Otherwise, usually you're safe inside that case on stuff that you're not going to be handling anything but 3.35 or 12 volts. But be aware that if it is doing the soft power, and if the power button goes back to the motherboard, then look out, you've got 120 volts probably running through your power board, your motherboard at one point, and that it's using the soft power situation. So we got that piece there. Older machines did not have soft power on them. Your newer machines are predominantly on soft power. The notes, make sure when you go to get a power supply, make sure it's got all the connectors you need. So if you're going to be running several SATA drives in there, make sure you've got several SATA connectors on it. Because when you start splitting the connectors beyond what they've got on there, you're stretching on how much power is going down it. And that you really don't want to do that. It probably will work fine for you, but you're stretching it on it, and it's going to make it a little harder if you go to accessing both SATA drives at the same time a lot of the time, that you're going to be straining your power on it. So do make sure you've got that. And then they go through and show us several connectors here. They've got an ATX connector, which is where it puts the power into the motherboard. And that was that big connector when y'all disconnected them back there, that you had that connector, and it provides your various powers going to the motherboard on. And remember, it only went in one way. The black wires are your ground ones. The other colors are, depending on which ones they are the 3.35 or 12 volts. The red ones should be 12 volts. The others, I can't remember which one's which. I really think the yellow is 3.35. 3x3. Then you've got connectors that will connect to power additionally for the processors. So depending on the type of processor you got, depending on the connector it needs to connect to the motherboard, where it feeds straight into the processor to provide power straight for the processor. Not counting all of the other things powered on the motherboard off that connector, but the processor's got its own, a lot of times separate power connector on it. That one's been was the Pentium one, but you actually still see it on some more newer ones. And then you've got the 8-pin one right there. And a 6-pin one similar. This one that's just got the 4 wires on it. No, I told you wrong on yellow. Yellow is not one of those. 3.3 is going to have to be 5. Because that connector is a standard older connector. And so that one too, a lot of your CD drives will typically use that, although a lot of them are starting to go to SATA now, but they stayed IDE for a good while, so that's your IDE one. Some of your other devices will still use that on there too, but that's gradually phasing out that one. The SATA power one has got a whole bunch of little connectors on it, and there's a thinner one on it, usually in colors like we're seeing right there. And so it's got your choices on that, and it's supplying the 5 and 12 volts, just like this one was, but in a different connector. But it plugs in on the SATA that only plugs one way, but it's a thinner connector that y'all disconnected from your hard drive back there. This one you disconnected from the CD drive. So a lot of CD drives are still, and DVD drives are still using IDE. The Mini Molex one, that one you'll still see on your power supplies, but you're probably not going to use on a new computer now, because that is for your diskette drives, your floppy drive, and you don't have those in the machines anymore. But you could, so it still includes that connector in there for you. Okay, but it's a small one of these, that is just a small little one. It's about half the size of these, and that it slides in there and only goes in one direction. And that should be, yep, I was going to say that should be it. They've got notes there on a couple of things they say is an indication of a bad power supply. Computer does not turn on. You've got a definite bad power supply then. Sporadically shuts off or reboots. That's definitely a power supply indicator. Okay. Could also be that you don't have a big enough power supply. Will cause that issue. A broken or noisy fan. And like I've already noted on that. Then they note before opening the case up, they said make sure the power cord is plugged into the wall. Didn't bother to tell you the other half of that one. Make sure the power cord is plugged securely into the power supply. I've seen that more often than the other one. Usually the power cable is into the wall, but sometimes it's gotten loose somewhere it plugs into the back of the power supply. So make sure it's secure, plugged in there on both ends. Where it plugs into it says into the wall, is probably into your surge protector. Make sure the surge protector is turned on. Okay, that your power strip's turned on. So I have seen that one too, where the surge protector was not turned on. The power strip had a switch on it and hadn't turned it on. Make sure the power switch is in the on position. Usually not a big issue on that one. And then the voltage switch is set to the correct voltage. I don't remember ever seeing one that had the voltage switch set to the wrong position. Because it's not easy to change that like I say, it's recessed in there, and so it's not something people are going to easily have changed or whatever. And then you can test each of the spots on them to see what the power is, and it should be plus or minus 5 volts, 0.5 volts of what's expected. So if it's the 12 volt wire, it should be between, it says there between 11.4 and 12.6, which is actually 0.6 different. The 5 volt one, it says between 4.7 and 5.25. Oh, that's plus or minus 5%. Okay. The 5 volt one between 4.7 and 5.25. If it's a rounding issue around the number you're trying to get, you're probably okay. And the 3.31, it says between 3.1 and 3.4. So it gets a little more precise on it. Questions on power supplies? But like I say, they have gotten much bigger as time has gone by. And if you're adding components to your computer, you may have to upgrade your power supply also. That if you decide you're going to put a different processor in there, or you're going to add a couple of more hard drives into it, you may not have a large enough power supply in there to support that. So you got to watch out for that. Y'all all know how to install and connect it at this point because you've all done it already. Okay? So you know at this point that the wires coming off of the power supply only fit at one point, that they're all specific type plugs on them that only plug at one point. So it's not a real hard one to goof up. You can plug them in whichever order you want to plug them in. You don't have to start from one to the other. On some of the machines, you got to plug that motherboard power connector in before you put the memory into the machine, because some of them, on how it fits into there, the memory gets in the way of trying to get to the motherboard plug. The CPU power connector, you don't always have a CPU power connector. I'm thinking on one or two of those machines back there y'all ran into, there was no CPU power connector. Even though they're supposed to all be the same machine, that they varied. And then plug in the SATA ones, make sure they all get plugged in. And your optical drive, and they're assuming that it's using the old IDE, but you can get SATA optical drives also. So as time goes by, we're going to see the IDE plug disappear. Just like we'll, at some point in the near future, you're going to see power supplies not having the floppy drive plug on them anymore either. If you did need the floppy plug drive, you can actually get adapters that will take it from the regular IDE one down to the floppy Molex one, mini Molex. So you can get adapter ones all over the place to switch back and forth around. You can get it where it will adapt the IDE to SATA. So there's a number of those on it. Motherboards, they talk about the CPU socket. You got to have the right socket for the type of CPU that you want to use. AMD uses a different socket than Intel, and then both of them use slightly different for some of their different CPUs. Memory slots, make sure you got how many ever memory slots you need in there. Suggestion if you're getting a new machine is have more memory slots than what memory you're putting in there at that point, so that then later on when you want more memory, you've got space to put it in there. Expansion slots, that on those, that you've got different ones of those. You're really not going to see much of the PCI one anymore, but you will see the PCIe and could see the PCIX one there for putting cards in there that are going to tend to be PCIe cards now and no longer be full PCI. But if you've got old PCI cards you want to use, you'd have to find a motherboard that will support that. But most of them aren't going to support standard PCI anymore. Likewise, most of them do have a graphics port in there now too, with the accelerated graphics port, the AGB slot, and it's the one where you gotta unloosen it, not just pull the board out, that you gotta pull the little clip on it to get it out of there. It doesn't let you just pull a video card out real easy, and it's a reversed card as far as how it matches up with the back. So you're not gonna put video cards into the wrong slot. And most of the time you do have one of those on there, even if you're not using a separate video card, if you're using the video. The motherboard can include a number of things built into it. And that's going to have all your plugs on the back that match off of it for you. And so you can have those built in, and you may use separate boards to support those instead, to do faster than what came with the motherboard, or if you had a failed part on it, that if the network connection fails on the motherboard works otherwise, you can go buy a network card and plug into it and keep on using it. So network card can be built into the motherboard. Audio cards are quite often built into the motherboard. So that's some of the plugs sitting back there on the back. That it's not on a separate card, but if you want it higher audio, you get a separate audio card instead for it to use the better one. Same thing for the video. It may or may not allow you to do the video through the motherboard, but it may. But usually it does. It usually has at least an SVGA connector built into the motherboard, and it may have more built into the motherboard, depending on the quality of motherboard you get. And then USB and FireWire connectors could be coming off the motherboard, but the motherboard's going to have connectors to go to your connectors on the outside for those. But it's not going to use, well, it could be, because you could have USB connections there too, straight off the motherboard. That you also will have where y'all saw where you plugged in the front panel ones plugged back into the motherboard, because they're really running off the motherboard. But it's not a separate thing. I/O connectors, in that those are the things that we were just mentioning about. They have the PS2 mouse and keyboard ports on there. It may not anymore, because I've seen some of the newer machines now that no longer have the PS2 connectors on there, which was the small little round plugs that plugged in. Because where are you going to plug the keyboard and mouse into normally now?
USB-A.
Into the USB. Okay? So you got USB ports always on there. Quite often off the motherboard, you've got 4 of those sitting direct on them, not counting the others plugged in that you're set of them on the front that plug off of the motherboard. Without, in addition to that, you could also put hubs coming off of the USB to have additional ones, because where you've got one USB port coming off of there, it can actually have up to 128 USB devices connected to that one port. That's the way USB is designed. Okay? Serial ports disappearing off the motherboard. So now that they're not used a lot of times on the machines anymore. Those of you, 1 or 2 of you, those of you in the Cisco class that we've seen where we actually did use the serial port in there the other day, but you're not seeing much of the serial ports anymore. Parallel port has pretty well disappeared off them. That was your printer port. be aware of that one, that's where the printers used to all plug into. Now, where do the printers plug into? Hmm? USB. So parallel port is, and serial, parallel port is pretty obsolete on it, that you don't even find those on them anymore. I don't think, I know they're not on our machines, okay? And that you don't see those hardly anymore, and serial ports are disappearing too off there. That's just about US and PS2's disappeared. So, changing world on that. Audio jacks, those still on there, although that can be done through USB also. Okay, so you've got some things that are using USB on that, so that my headphone that I'm using in my office, headphone and microphone, it goes through USB. I don't have to go figure out which one to plug it into of the green, blue, and I don't remember what line in is. And then, but you do have the Ethernet ports normally still on them. Although that's going to gradually disappear as you put more and more towards them on wireless, and that if you did need to use a Ethernet, that you may well have to get an adapter from USB to Ethernet. And there are adapters for that. And then on the motherboard itself, there are connectors to the front panel items. Also connectors for the lights that you have flashing on the front, that those plug back into spots. That is one that gets complicated on you plugging stuff into the motherboard. Is that those light ones plugging in, that's usually a whole series of just 2-pin connectors, and it's plugging that wire into the correct set of the 2 pins on sometimes 8 or 10 of them plug all together and getting them plugged into the right spot there. So that then the correct light indicates the correct thing for you. Plug it in wrong, what the case is saying is showing whether it's on or off, maybe showing whether you're accessing the hard drive or not, if you plugged it in backwards. No big harm other than that it's confusing on that one. Firmware is what's built into it. It could be using BIOS or it could be using UEFI. UEFI is the newer way on it. Okay? Now, if you're using, your BIOS is actually using UEFI, it will give you an option there in your CMOS setup to choose to use UEFI or BIOS. And to get some things to being able to where you can get into them to work on correctly, you got to go back into BIOS. And I'm trying to think what it is I've been doing recently that I've had to go into the CMOS setup to change, saying that we're going to use BIOS instead of UEFI so I can make changes on it. And I'm thinking it was how it accesses the hard drive for some reason to give me other access to it. The BIOS is your basic input-output system, which is the way they've always been. And that tells it when you turn the machine on, the BIOS is got the firmware with the BIOS that tells it how to do the basic start of the system. Doesn't include Windows, it's just telling it how to start the machine itself up and where to go look to find the operating system. Everybody follow on that? So whether you got Linux or Windows or whatever on your machine, it's going to be located in a specific spot on hard drive, etc., and that you'll set it in your CMOS settings to tell it which devices to go look at. The CMOS is just settings for the BIOS. UEFI is going to also be running off of that CMOS settings, but it's the newer way, and it's got more built-in things to it, and that's only been out a few years now, using the UEFI instead of the BIOS. That is a lot older motherboard, stored the BIOS on removable chips. It's been a good while since you could remove the chips with the BIOS on. You can change, update the BIOS on there, because you can go out and get it and it burns it back into it to replace it. And it's a downgradable upgrade item from your manufacturer. CMOS battery. That it retains the CMOS settings, so it keeps the time and date when it has no power. And says here that in older motherboards, the CMOS battery is also used to retain BIOS configuration settings. I haven't run into one yet that didn't still store it that way, that I was aware of. That if you pulled the battery, that you erased your CMOS configuration settings. As we were talking about the other day in here, that will get rid of the password if you put a password on the BIOS on it. That's stored in the CMOS actually, and so pulling that battery will kill that password on it. That if you've got a BIOS password, it'll get there. Chipset is just there for working with the communications between the processor, the memory, and the peripheral devices. They talk about the North Bridge and the South Bridge chip. North Bridge chip is going to be near the CPU, and it takes all the data from the processor to the front side bus. So it communicates between the processor and the memory and the graphics card. And then the South Bridge chip handles your real-time clock, which is not your time of the day clock, but that's the one that's clocking the machine. So that when you hear about it does something every so many microseconds or gigaseconds or whatever, that's the real-time clock. That's where it's the internal clocking of it. That's not the time of the day. So the fact it's 11 something now, that's not on the real-time clock. The real-time clock is just a clocking mechanism to tell the machine, here's the time we're doing stuff at, how we're doing on it. Power management is part of the South Bridge one, and then the controllers for the PCI bus and the USB buses. They mentioned those both to you. You see those occasionally mentioned, but you don't see much out there about the North Bridge and South Bridge on it. And that now we've moved away from the North Bridge and South Bridge to where it's all controlled in there on the CPU and not doing it on separate chipsets to it. And then they show you an illustration of a motherboard down there with things pointed out to you, so that there, this one actually had 3 USB spots where they could connect to spots on the front panel, ports for that. There's where the items for the front panel, other than the USB ports, would all plug into on this one. The SATA connectors, this one happened to have to allow 8 different SATA items to plug into it. That's a bunch on a motherboard. Usually 4 is what I've found is typical, more typical, 2 to 4. There's a PCI slot, a PCIe slots. And the PCIe ones can come in 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, I think, and you got to know what the correct number is goes on the end of it. Now, the smaller ones can fit into the bigger ones, but the bigger ones will not fit into the smaller ones. So everybody follow on that? And I hit that recently when I was trying to, I think it was a video card actually, which I was using, trying to put into a machine on it, that I ran into that problem on. There's their CPU power on it. There's the CPU. Y'all have pulled the CPU out and put it back in at this point, so you know what those are. And there's their memory slots. That one's got, again, 6 memory slots on it. 4 is more common out there, but their illustration's got that. And for the fan that belongs on the case, not the power supply fan, but the fan that's on your case, that remember we had to find the place to plug that one into also. So they've got that one located there for you. Questions on that? PCIe for the video card was their example that they had you do, and then several other items they've got a lab for you to do on it. Power issues, again, they mentioned the ones we already mentioned. If it unexpectedly keeps shutting down, check the power supply, check to see what the power is on it. We've got a power supply tester coming in, but I don't think it's come in yet, and so we'll look at that and see how to use the power supply tester. But we'll look at what y'all run multimeters. So I think we got the multimeters, but we may not have them yet. And let y'all test on that stuff. If it keeps rebooting itself, that is an indication of a power supply issue. Or if it won't boot at all, you may well have a power supply issue, but you may have something else that's dead short on the motherboard that keeps it from turning on also. Then they tell you what to do about that. Purchase a new one, remove the old one, mount the new one, connect it, and power it on to see if it eliminates. For test purposes right there of trying to find out what the problem is, you could put a smaller power supply in that you've got an extra one of right there without hooking all the equipment up on it, and see if that does solve the problem. And bring it up and see if it won't turn on, testing it to see off of an older power supply. Boot errors when it runs through the post test, which is the power on self test. It will give you beeps on a lot of them. It will beep at you and tell you if it runs into problems, and the beeps will tell you what the problems are. You can look up the beeps, and it depends on what type of motherboard you've got right there, of which one what the beeps are you're going to be dealing with. And you can look those up out there on the internet, look up according to what you've got there and see what the beeps are. They're going to be long and short beeps. And so if you get a couple of short beeps, that tells you one thing. A couple of long beeps tells you something else. A long beep and short beep tells you something else. And so the beeps tell you all kinds of things about problems it runs into as it boots up. Okay? And that's going to be before we get to booting the operating system. That's just turning the physical machine on. Does everybody follow on that? It will also often give you numeric codes on the screen for it. But the reason for the beeps is it may not be able to send stuff to the screen. If it's a video problem, that it can't send it to the screen, so you wouldn't be able to have any idea what the problem is. But with the beeps, you'd be able to still tell. And it's using the built-in speaker in there, which is not a very good one. Okay. And then it could display error messages on the screen for you too. So if you can get it where it's showing you numbers on the screen or error messages, that's going to be more. But again, Google is your friend on beeps and error codes to look them up. That you can just go out and Google the error code it's got there. If it doesn't give you the error message with it, or if it does give you the error message and you're going, I'm not exactly sure what it's trying to tell me is wrong, Google it. Likewise, if you're getting beeps on the machine when you turn it on and nothing happens, listen and see what the beeps are, how many short and long ones you are getting. It's basically like Morse code. Okay? And then Google that on it. So if you're getting 2 short and 1 long, go out there and just Google post 2 short, 1 long. And you're going to find plenty of articles that will tell you exactly what that is. Somebody that works on all of those all the time, of dealing with that all the time, could tell you what a number of them are, but unless you're dealing with that type error all the time, you're not going to know what those codes are to carry around in your head. Because as you go on through the course, you're going to figure out there's only so much you can carry in your head. Capacitors could go bad as they go over time. Pretty much if you got a capacitor that goes bad, and they will swell. I have seen them swollen up. I have also seen them burn themselves on the board when they swell up, etc., when they couldn't hold the right power on it. And I have seen them literally burn on it, smoke and burn. That you look at the motherboard and go, yeah, I see what's wrong with your motherboard. That is distinctly a blacked out spot on the motherboard that you know it burned up on that one there. You also see them expand and that they've gotten big laying there on the motherboard. And so if the capacitors go bad, basically the best thing to do, you could go in and try to unsolder the capacitor and solder another one in, but if you look at how intricate everything is on that motherboard, that's probably not a real good move on it, but you could try that if you want it. Is just to replace the motherboard's probably your option at that point. So the other part is, if that capacitor has gone bad, something else is probably headed bad next. So in the older days, that back in the 80s and stuff, yes, you did go in and replace those sometimes. And on larger machines, sometimes people did do that. Missing settings. Bias and UEFI, sorry. Then you got to have a constant supply of power to hold those. And that little battery in there keeps all of that going. If the settings start messing up on you or the time drops off, your little battery in there is dying, and you can go get another one of those batteries. Most of them are using the 2032 battery, which you can actually go to Dollar Tree and buy cheap replacement ones sometimes for them, or go to other places and get them. So you can find those batteries in different stores nowadays where they didn't used to be as much. Overheating, if the machine is overheating, which is going to mess up your machine on how it acts and everything else, look in there for, like I said, make sure the air can flow through it. So clean the dust out of it. Open it up and clean it all out. A can of compressed air is real useful. A thing to be careful with the compressed air on is keep moving around, don't hold it in one place, or you will freeze parts at that point. Okay? If you do that, make sure you do let it dry out first before you go to turn it on, because you will put ice and moisture on there, and you got to let it dry again or you'll short things in turn. The other part is when you freeze the parts there, that you can break parts on it too. So if you're using the compressed air, keep the can moving. Don't blow in one spot. If you decide to use it on your keyboard, you can discolor your keyboard from it. When it freezes that plastic, the plastic will change colors on you. Make sure the fans are properly installed, that they're pulling the air through correctly. So that's working. If you've got a fan on the front and back of the computer, one of them should be pulling in and one of them blowing out, not both of them blowing out. Does everybody follow on that? Now, the power supply one's always going to be blowing out, but as far as down in the case unit, if you've got two fans down in there, have one coming in and one going out. But usually if you only got one of those down there, it's usually blowing out also. So that then on the other side of the case, it's pulling the air for both the power supply and the case. Dust buildup, do be careful on that one. Clean them occasionally. And I have seen some really dirty ones, because I remember one that was at a steel fabrication plant that I worked on one time that they told me the machine had gotten exceedingly slow on them, and all it was dust buildup. it had this thick of not light little dust, but heavy oily dust all through it that I just reached in and would pull out globs of it before I even went to the compressed air approach. That pulled those out, throwing in the trash can, and then took it out front in their front yard and used the compressed air on, cleaning it on off beyond that. Plugged it back in and it ran a whole lot better. The owner of the plant was real embarrassed when I opened the case up and she was going, I can't believe all of that dirt in there. And I'm going, well, that happens, but people don't normally open the case up. And they had kept the outside of the case clean, but it'd be all built up inside the case. And then a lot of times when you're blowing from the outside, you're just forcing it down onto the stuff inside in there. So do be aware of that. Also, what is the temperature in the room? In here, we're headed for problems in these rooms. Just one thing I've already observed, which fits right with here. Environmental heat. These cases up here, where they've got the computer sitting in and they've got the box that controls all of this overhead and all of that stuff, and it's about the same size as the computer sitting there. There is no ventilation in holes in these cases. If I lock that door closed, there is absolutely no airflow in there. If it's sitting there at least open, it's getting a little airflow in there. I can reach in there, and the temperature in these boxes, in these cabinets sitting here, is a good number of degrees above the room. It needs ventilation holes in it, but they've got absolutely no, because usually on these cabinets, there's a slot across the top of here that has been cut out and left open, and that lets the hot air come out the back. But that's not there, and the bottom of it's a solid thing too. Not a real good design of a cabinet that's supposed to be holding electronic equipment to have no ventilation holes on it. Because no matter how well we've got that computer sitting in there ventilated, it's not doing any good when it can't get the air on out into the room. And I'm going to point that one out to the school, that they need to come take a saw to these cabinets or a drill and get some vents in them. Because the other alternative is, with this raised part up here, is, if nothing else, just take this off temporarily and just drill a whole bunch of holes across the top, and still be a secure cabinet, but would let the heat out. It's also a fire hazard. And most of your motherboards are going to shut down when they get to a certain temperature. And you can actually check temperatures on them, and you can go out and get third-party free utilities that will tell you what temperature your machine and your CPU is running at. Do see smoke or a burning smell, shut it off immediately. Could be that connectors aren't properly seated correctly and the electricity's arching on it. Could be a short circuit on the printed board. Could be an improperly installed component. Not plugging the memory card completely into there will cause a short that will cause it to proceed to smoke and burn the memory card. I had a class 20 years ago that went to do, just like y'all were doing in here, I think they were doing the complete assembly and reassemble, or they were putting components. They had been taking the memory out and putting memory back in to see how to do on it, and one of the students didn't get the memory completely pushed down in there. I was in that corner, they were in that corner, and they turned it on, and I was the first one in the room that smelled smoke. Because I was working on a machine up in that corner, and I said, whoa, whose machine's smoking? And they went, I don't know. And somebody said, oh, I smell it too. And about then they started figuring out where it was, as I was headed for where the smell seemed like it was coming from. And we hit the power on it at that point. Turned out we really didn't damage anything from it. We did put a little smoke damage on the memory card, but the memory Card still worked in there. But it would have been more than likely that we would have stopped it. And that would have been on how quick we did that. So if you do smell something burning or that there is smoke, first thing is kill the power to the machine. Okay? And more than likely you've stopped your fire at that point, because it's just an electrical fire occurring on it. Questions on all of that? Then, according to my watch, we've got 2 minutes left to go, so we'll stop. Covered a little bit of stuff. You taking them all apart the first day works nicely for us here, because now as we're talking along on these things, those of you that have not worked in the machines know what it is we're talking about because you've handled it. And now you're learning more about on it. And those of you that had been in there, that doesn't put you up at an advantage on the others, but you've all touched all of the stuff. So by Wednesday night, and we got class Wednesday, take the chapter 1, chapter 2 test. Okay? And then we'll continue on 3 on Wednesday. Tomorrow, I won't be here. Okay? Because I've got the award ceremony to go to tomorrow. So, in the morning, since it's at 11:30, which means I gotta leave by 10, I'll probably will be on Walker for a little while in the morning, or I just may work from the house, getting ready to head on down there. To go down there, and it doesn't finish till like 1 or 1:30, and then I'll go back to Walker for the afternoon. And then Wednesday I'll be here. But do allow yourself time on taking that test. And it is 50 questions. I went through and chose questions. Most of it should match to what we did in class. That I eliminated questions that we hadn't talked about, or they had some obsolete questions on there that I was going, I'm not going to ask you that. So I eliminated those questions. There are no simulations on there. They're all multiple choice type questions. Multiple choice or multiple answer. Okay? So you don't have to worry about using the simulator to do anything on the test. Any questions? Then I will see you Wednesday.